Welcome to the first Daily Politics election debate of 2015. I'm Andrew Neil. The environment is an area of policy that spans everything from the size of your gas bill to the quality of the air we breathe. And today the party spokesman will be debating this key concern. Caroline Flint is Labour's Shadow Energy and Climate Change Secretary. Matt Hancock is the Conservative Energy Minister. Andrew Cooper represents the Green Party. Ed Davey is the Energy and Climate Change Secretary. He's a Liberal Democrat. And Roger Helmer is UKIP's energy spokesman. Thus, I'm joined by the BBC's environment analyst, Roger Harriman. Now, in a moment, our politicians will be setting out why they believe they've got the right answers in this key policy area. But first, a reminder of what's at stake. At the heart of this election is the question of whether people are feeling the benefits of the recovery. And that's meant an intense political focus on the price of energy. A promise by Labour to freeze prices back in 2013 grabbed the headlines. But since then, world energy prices, in particular oil, have plunged. Household bills have started to follow, but the major energy companies still stand accused of failing to pass on all their savings. Part of the reason for higher bills has been the use of green levies to help combat climate change, charges the Conservatives have been rolling back. When it comes to generating power, Britain urgently needs to do something about its ageing network of power stations. But there are deep divisions over whether we should look to newer technologies, such as wind, or fracking for shale gas. It's sometimes said politicians ignore the countryside, but that's hard to do when it presents so many pressing questions over where to build new homes, badger culls, and what to do about flooding. So, it's a question of keeping the lights on, protecting the environment, and helping rural communities. And in the next hour, you decide which party has the answers. Well, just before we came on air, our politicians drew lots to decide the order in which they would make their pitches. And Caroline Flint won, or lost, depending on how you think of it. So she's going to go first. Caroline Flint, please go to the lectern. Caroline Flint has been Labour's Shadow Energy and Climate Change Secretary since 2011. Before that, she was a minister under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. Caroline Flint.
Thank you. Labour will build a cleaner, greener Britain on sound economic foundations. We'll protect publicly owned forests and bring nature closer to people, end the failed badger cull and defend the hunting ban, and deliver an ambitious flood adaptation programme to serve every community. Energy bills are £300 higher than 2010, so Labour will freeze energy prices until 2017, so bills can only fall and not rise, while we reform the energy market. Labour will tackle climate change with a clear target to decarbonise our power supply by 2030, creating the secure, affordable, cleaner energy Britain needs, alongside a fully funded 10-year plan to insulate 5 million homes, creating jobs and apprenticeships for British firms. Labour, a better plan, a better future.
Caroline, thank you for that. Now, you famously complained about being used as female window dressing in Gordon Brown's government. I can see you remember it. So how did you feel when Ed Miliband appointed John Prescott to lead the UK's climate negotiations instead of his female shadow climate secretary?
Well, actually, what Ed did was ask John Prescott to be part of our team, and John Prescott's got fantastic experience in this area. But, you know, Ed and myself are leading the policy on climate change, and I'm very proud, given how passionate Ed Miliband is about this issue, that he supported me 100% over the last 4 years I've been doing this job. So I very much welcome the support from John. I see it as an advantage.
All right, Caroline Flint, thank you very much. Now, Matt Hancock is one of the Conservative ministers in the Department of Energy and Climate Change. He's responsible for energy. In a previous life, he was an economist at the Bank of England and an economic advisor to George Osborne.
Over and again, this government has confronted some of the biggest long-term challenges our country faces. And just as we've confronted challenges on the economy, which is now delivering jobs and growth, so we've confronted the challenges of reforming our creaking energy infrastructure while protecting the environment and controlling costs for consumers. And the result is that investment is increasing, emissions are falling, and bills are coming down. But there is more to do. And I believe that by harnessing human ingenuity and with a long-term plan to secure clean, reliable energy in a way that doesn't cost the earth, we can rise to this great challenge. That is what I stand for, to secure a better future for you, your family, and for Britain.
Matt Hancock, Lib Dem Ed Davey, your colleague in the department, he's spoken about taking on the Tory dinosaurs over energy policy. So as the Tory energy minister, that must make you one of the dinosaurs.
Well, I don't think I'm a dinosaur. In fact, we've worked closely together in the coalition on energy policy, and we've had successes, and bills are starting to fall, and we've made the market more competitive. But ultimately, we need a long-term solution to these challenges, and that means getting the investment we need, but also doing in a way that meets our international climate obligations, but does it in a way that reduces costs. And that's what we've been working on together.
Matt Hancock, thank you very much. Andrew Cooper is the Green Party spokesman on energy. He's hoping to be elected as an MP in Huddersfield. He was once named one of the UK's top environmental journalists by The Independent on Sunday. Andrew Cooper.
We will take power back from the big six energy providers and create an energy generating democracy where people and communities generate their own heat and power from renewable sources. We will end the misery of cold homes and fuel poverty for millions through a mass insulation programme. This will substantially reduce the energy wasted heating drafty, poorly insulated homes. We have a plan to reduce carbon emissions that is based on climate science. There should be no more warm words on climate change without the policies and programmes we need to address the problem. Voting Green and electing Green MPs is the best way to ensure that addressing climate change is really taken seriously.
Andrew Cooper, your party wants to ban the advertising of foreign holidays. So how many foreign holidays are you going to allow us to take if you ever ended up in government?
Of course, we've got to look at things like air travel and the impact that has on the environment. But there are lots of sustainable ways that people can go abroad. We've got the Channel Link that's there now. Lots of people can get abroad and use that way of getting about.
All right, Andrew Cooper, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
And next it's the turn of the Energy and Climate Change Secretary, the Liberal Democrat Ed Davey. He's been in the job since 2012, and before that he was a minister in the Business Department. Ed Davey.
Liberal Democrats successfully fought to green the coalition. Under our leadership, Britain's renewable electricity nearly trebled with record clean energy investment. On climate change, we led a historic EU deal with world-leading carbon reduction targets, not something Conservative ministers would have done alone. And we proved the best way to cut energy bills is increased competition and saving energy. We even found time to plant 1 million trees. The Lib Dem manifesto builds on that record with 5 green laws for green transport, zero waste, nature, green bills and zero carbon Britain. From cleaner air to warmer homes, our policies are good for your health, your pocket and your planet. Thank you.
Now, Ed Davey, you've travelled 100,000 miles by air since you took office. That's 4 times round the world. It's an Al Gore-sized carbon footprint. Is that a case of do as I say, not as I do?
No, because climate change is international. You have to work with other countries. I've negotiated with the Americans, the Chinese, the Indians, as well as across Europe. And if you're going to get the global deal that we desperately need on climate change, being discussed in Paris this year, critical set of negotiations, you have to work with other countries, and that does mean travelling.
Okay, Davey, thank you. And finally, Roger Helmer is UKIP spokesman on energy and industry. He's one of the party's MEPs. He came second in the New York by-election last year.
Our current UK energy policy is a disaster. Gross overinvestment in expensive and intermittent renewables has pushed up energy prices, forcing households and pensioners into fuel poverty. Energy prices are undermining industrial competitiveness. Energy-intensive industries like steel, aluminium, chemicals, glass, cement, petroleum refining are closing plants and moving their jobs and investment out of the UK and the EU altogether. More than a third of Europe's aluminium smelting capacity has closed in the last 7 years. So imports increase and our balance of payments suffers. Often these industries go to jurisdictions with lower environmental standards, leading to higher emissions. Ed Davey presides over an energy policy which undermines the British economy while arguably increasing global emissions. UKIP will stop this nonsense and deliver secure and affordable energy based on coal, gas and nuclear.
Roger Helmer, you once tweeted that the Badger Cull would, quote, bring down the exorbitant price of shaving brushes. Was that the main reason for UKIP's support of the Cull?
Not at all. And I'm distressed at the way that our opponents don't seem to have any kind of sense of humour. Every time I've attempted some sort of joke, it's picked up as though it had been intended seriously. Of course it wasn't. We're supporting the Badger Cull because we believe that bovine TB is an enormous threat to our agriculture and indeed our food security, and we think that is an appropriate way to stop it.
All right, Roger Helmer, thank you very much. If you could take your place back there, we'll get this debate underway. We'll start with climate change and the consequences for energy policy that climate change has brought. Matthew Hancock, in 2010, the Tories urged people to, quote, vote blue to go green. You're not saying that this time round. Why not?
Well, because people can look at the record amount of investment in renewables. 19% of our electricity last year came from renewables. That's trebled under this government. They can look at the fact that there are now over 90% of the solar power that's installed in Britain has been installed under a Conservative Prime Minister. And in fact, 1 million people now live in homes that have solar panels on them. And so we have a record, and it's a record we're proud of, where despite the fact that we've managed to turn the economy around and the economy's been growing, emissions have been falling.
All
so
right.
that's a record that we can be proud of.
Is Matt Hancock a dinosaur?
He's not a dinosaur, but many of his colleagues are. We've had to fight in the coalition almost every day for renewables. We had people like Eric Pickles stopping us with onshore wind and solar power, and Liberal Democrats have had to work really hard to make sure the renewable investment has come. Fortunately, it did because we were there. But, you know, Matt, you can't say you like renewables and then have your policy in onshore wind. It's like saying you like the Rolling Stones and not liking Mick Jagger. I mean, it's quite a completely inconsistent policy.
But the coalition government, I mean, the reason why the coalition government have had to, both the Tories and the Liberal Democrat side of the government have had to address these issues is because of the Climate Change Act that was brought in 2008 under Ed Miliband. I'm very proud that actually only 5 MPs voted against that, in the sense of it showed what a majority of support there was in Parliament to set the way forward for the direction of travel for having renewables. And what we've had is this back and forth between the two sides of the coalition, which has undermined our credibility. And there is nothing in the Conservative manifesto around taking out carbon from our power supply that can help provide the certainty for jobs and investment going forward, but also cleaning up our power supply.
The reality of this is that there are only 2 countries in the whole of Europe who produce less renewable energy than the UK, and that's Malta and Luxembourg. When we actually look at ourselves in the context of Europe, we're way behind. We're about 5% of total energy is actually coming from renewable sources. In Sweden, it's over 50%.
Renewable electricity has trebled.
That's the whole point, because you're only talking about electricity. You're only talking about electricity. You're avoiding heat.
No, we're not.
You are avoiding heat.
We've got the world's first ever heat incentive. When our heat policies now with heat networks and so on are really taking off.
Let me just give you,
nothing on heat.
You have signed up.
That's not true.
As all of you have, I think, except probably UKIP, you've all signed up to a renewable target, not just in electricity, but all energy has to be renewable, 15%. By 2020. It's only 5 years ago, but in fact you've only reached 5%. You're not going to hit 15, are you?
We are on target. Renewable electricity.
You've only got 5%.
Hold on, let me finish. Renewable electricity has nearly trebled under this government. It's going to beat the target we set for renewable electricity in 2020. And heat and transport have been slower. That is true. But they are now coming on much faster.
But a lot of the plant in terms of renewable energy were conceived and thought about under the last Labour government. Yes, they've come online under the coalition government. I accept that. But the planning for them started before that. And actually, the rate of investment in renewables, the Environment Audit Committee of the House of Commons cross-party has said is at half the rate it needs to be to get us to where we need to be. Now that's why the decarbonisation target is so important.
We're ignoring the elephant in the room. Matt Hancock said that emissions are down. Emissions within our geographical boundaries are down. If you include the emissions on the products which we have imported, because, as I said earlier, we have displaced major energy-intensive industries out of Britain out of Europe, if you add in those emissions are going up.
No, not true.
Actually,
hold on.
This year,
Hold on.
for the first time.
Let me go to Matt
hold on.
Hancock, then I'll come.
We got some of the steelworks going again, like at Redcar. But there's a question from something that Caroline's just said and was announced today by the Labour Party, which was that we should entirely decarbonise our electricity sector by 2030. And the Committee on Climate Change Research shows that would cost £96 on every bill. So
let's
who's
ask-
going to pay
Thank
for
you.
it?
Caroline, please.
Well, thank you for letting me answer. That's just not true. We've always been very clear when we argued for it when there was an energy legislation going through Parliament, which the government, Liberals and Tories didn't support. We've always said it should be in line with the Committee on Climate Change, which is to get to a place where we can be between 50 and 100 grams per kilowatt hour. Today it's around 450 grams.
So are you in
Andrew,
favour of
so
this
we've been very
decarbonisation
clear.
target or not? Because the
we've-
decarbonisation target
Did you not
costs
hear what I said? I'm sorry, did you?
£96 on every bill.
Let me answer that as well to you, because again, Lord Devon, who's the former Tory MP, John Gummer, has said very clearly two things. We've said that the decarbonisation target should be in line with the Committee on Climate Change. That is about carbon intensity. But they've also said you've got to look at the cost of not decarbonising our electricity sector. And they have shown, when Tory Central Office sent something out saying exactly what Matt Hancock is saying today, is actually it will cost us more in the long run if we don't
Can
move
I get
to
a,
this.
can I just
are you
take it?
saying
Hold
that
on,
you
hold
think
on.
that
Can
there
I just
isn't a
want
cost?
a matter
I
of
haven't
fact
said
here?
there isn't a cost, but there's a
what
bigger
is the
cost.
cost?
But
Caroline,
there's a
please.
bigger cost if you
Hold
rely
on,
on where we
Caroline,
are at
but
the
I
moment.
want to
And
establish
that's the
something
truth.
in your manifesto. Is it not true that your manifesto sets out a legal target to remove carbon from the UK's electricity supply by 2030?
It is about removing carbon, but we've said all the time, Andrew,
Well, have
in
you
line,
set out a legal target, or haven't you?
we've said in line with the Committee on Climate Change.
Well, is it legal or not?
No, but we want to have a legal target because
Okay.
that's why we will do it. We had the chance, Andrew, in Parliament. Unfortunately, the Tories and the Liberal Democrats did not support Labour's policy
It's on-
to have this on the statute book, and therefore they've delayed it till 2016. So a Labour government will act on this.
It's
But
on
does it
page
not
20
mean-
of the manifesto,
does
and the
it
key
not
question
mean-
is,
Sorry,
will
do
it
you have
cost
it in your
£96?
manifesto? No, you don't. You do not support it.
Yes, Roger.
Can I throw some
Roger.
light on this? Okay. I've just spoken to Caroline about this because I wanted to ask her about this. Labour's manifesto looks like it's going to take 100% of the carbon out of electricity by 2030, which most experts I've spoken
But
to
Roger, you know that
say is completely unachievable. You've clarified that actually it's not quite 100%.
No.
You want something less than 100%, but the manifesto doesn't look like that. And if I can just put in a
Roger.
clarification, hang on a sec, just put a clarification on the renewables as well. We are moving fast now on renewable electricity from an extremely low base, but overall we are still lagging way behind on the overall renewable energy target. So
to get-
Ed is being a
I
bit
think it's-
misleading
I
because he,
think it's-
he keeps
No,
putting
I
onto
actually-
electricity.
I
It's
said
general
very
energy we
clearly,
need to be
as
talking
the
about.
record will show, that we're behind on transport and heat.
But that's-
but
I
we
think
have
the
been
info-
we have been accelerating that because we had very little done by the last Labour government. One of the issues on this debate, though, is about international work because the UK is only responsible for 1.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So you have to work internationally with other countries. I'm very proud of what we delivered at the EU, the most ambitious greenhouse gas target for the whole of the world.
Germany is building coal. Germany is
And the
building
problem,
coal. Japan is building coal.
the problem for UKIP and the Conservative Party, their position on Europe would undermine the international efforts on climate change.
All right.
And
Well,
that's
and we'd be very happy to do
and
that.
that's why. Well, that
All right,
speaks volumes.
okay, I
You
want
don't
to
even
hear
believe
from
climate change
Andrew
happening.
Sparrow
do you?
I do
reacting.
believe climate
Are
change
we
is
going to
happening.
hit our 15% overall energy renewable target?
There's no way the current rate of growth that we're actually going to achieve.
Well,
that
thank
target.
heavens for that.
And so, I mean, I think the important thing here is to actually sort of look at Europe and look what's been going on, because the UK played a disgraceful role, really, along with Poland, in actually
You're seen as the
No,
champion.
you have
in
to-
actually sort of getting rid of an energy efficiency and renewables target, working with Poland. Most of the countries want an energy efficiency target. Most of the countries want a renewables target. And so those are the sort of things which are actually holding back
All right,
industry in this country. And yes,
understand.
it is
I want to come to
true.
Roger Harvey.
Negotiation.
I want to come back to Caroline Flint because Roger Harvey an interesting point. If we are going to largely decarbonise our electricity generation by 2030, whether it's legal or not, that means that we will by then overwhelmingly be dependent on nuclear power and on renewables. They are both between 2 and 3 times as expensive as current fossil fuel generation. Our bills have to go up, don't they? They're bound to go up with that target.
Well, there's also carbon capture and storage as well,
Which
is
we don't
something
yet have the technology.
Well, hang on a
adds to the
second.
cost
Well,
of
hang on a
coal,
second.
dramatically
There are
adds to the
eight.
cost.
There are 8 operational plants around the world that are doing carbon capture and storage at the moment. In America, in Canada, there's one in Algeria, as well as one off the coast
Not
of Norway.
on a massive scale.
But they are producing something like, I think, 23 million tonnes of CO2 they're capturing each
pushing
year.
up prices,
So from what
pushing
I'm
up
told,
Hold on, I'll come
from
to
what
you.
I'm told, Andrew, is the technology's there. What we need to do, and unfortunately there have been delays under this government, is power forward in terms of what we can do in this area. But the truth is this, there are costs to this, but let's remember on our bills, the green levies only amount to £60 of an average bill of £1,300, and we've had our bills go up £300 in the last few years. But it's about recognising what are the costs if we don't move to cleaner energy, and that's important too.
All right.
And to the point made about heat as well. Look, green gas, National Grid have said, could form 40% of our domestic supply. That's another option that we should be looking at in the future. And the truth is, for transport, one of the reasons why decarbonising our power sector is so important, it can create the energy for the electric cars. But you have to do that to be able to marshal the amount of outputs in transport.
Okay,
that
let
are
me come
necessary.
to Roger Helmer.
So bang
please.
goes
Hold on,
Labour's-
hold on,
bang
hold
goes
on.
Labour's
Roger
second
Helmer,
price,
I have a question for you.
Caroline-
No, hold on. You don't think climate change is man-made, but you admit that that's just, in your own words, speculation. Is that how you make UKIP policy?
No, it's how Caroline is making Labour policy, because she wants
I think you
to
should answer your own
respond to
policy.
this speculative man-made climate change
So you
theory
don't believe
with
in it, Roger?
enormous costs. I believe, Caroline, in
Do you
climate
believe
change.
do you believe in man-made climate
I
change?
do not believe that the changes in climate are substantially caused by human activity.
Well,
no.
then you are in a
And
very
if you
small
let-
party of
Well-
people
well, no,
who
I'm in a-
believe that, and you're putting a lot
No,
of things
You have to let him finish.
How many people on the doorstep have raised the issue of climate change? I've been knocking on a lot of doors. I haven't come across it
That,
yet.
that doesn't mean
But-
it's not true, though.
It doesn't mean it's not true, no, but it means it is a speculative proposition, a forecast based on computer models which have been
Or
time and
scientific
again
evidence.
proved
Simply
wrong.
not the
There
case.
All right.
has been no further global warming for 18 years.
Well, I think,
the total global
It's the
warming in
six.
the last 100 years is less than 1 degree. That is exactly what we saw 1,000 years ago in the medieval warm period, 2,000
All right.
years
Not
ago in
only-
the Roman
not only-
optimum.
not
No, hold on,
3,000
Caroline.
years ago
We have
in
to
the Minoan
let
optimum.
me come to Ed Davey, because global temperatures haven't risen. Surface temperatures haven't risen now for more than 18 years. We're in the 19th year. How long does this pause have to go on before you reconsider spending tens of billions of pounds on climate change?
Well, not only do the models predict this type of pause, but they also track the global warming and greenhouse gases and climate change in other ways. The heat in the oceans, the acidity in the oceans, whether the polar caps are and the glaciers are melting, the rise in the sea levels. All these other indicators of climate change are happening. You picked on just one, Andrew. That's a big mistake.
Could you tell me
if
which
you look at all
model-
the, if
could
you
you
talk
tell
to
me
the
which
scientists,
models predicted the pause?
several of the major
Which ones?
international. If you look at
Because the IPCC didn't mention them.
no, if you look at some of the people who work for the IPCC, they predict this
But they
pause.
didn't put it into the report, which was based on the climate
They
model.
predicted it after the event.
But if you look
Roger,
at
let-
the report, they say exactly what I've just said, that there are many indicators
Roger.
of climate change.
Okay, two things. Firstly, the pause was not well expected by climate scientists. They've been scratching their heads about what's causing it. They're still very confident that global temperatures will continue to rise, as indeed are a lot of climate contrarians in this country
And what do you
now too.
think-
But I'd like to ask a question to Roger Helmer, if I may. Roger, you say it's all speculative and based on computer models.
Yes.
There's one thing that's not based on computer models, and that is our predictions about ocean acidification. The CO2 being soaked up by the oceans, turning the oceans more acidic. That is a scientific fact. I'm presuming that you agree with that. And can I ask a supplementary as well, is why is it that almost all climate skeptics, not all, almost all of them, are from parties on the right? Why do you think that would be?
Roger Helmer?
Well, I think that there is a left-wing tendency to jump on new ideas that seem appealing and do things with them. But on ocean acidity, if you look back, as I'm sure you know, Roger, over the history of the Earth and the climate in the long term, the CO2 levels we have at the moment, as low as 0.04%, is, in geohistorical terms, very low indeed. Now, there has been life in the oceans, including life with shells, which are supposed to dissolve with ocean acidification, for at least 600 million years. The fact that they have survived through much higher CO2 levels gives me confidence that they will continue to do so.
Matt Hancock, do you think that last year's floods were caused by climate change?
Well, I think that there has been an increase in erratic behaviour of the environment, yes. And
And is that caused by climate change?
Well, I think there's no doubt that there are changes in the climate, I think highly likely to be man-made. And frankly, from my point of view, all of this debate demonstrates very clearly that there are very significant risks from climate change that we need to mitigate. But we need to do it in a balanced way to try to
Most
reduce
Conservative
the costs of
voters
doing it.
don't think the flooding was caused by climate change in a recent YouGov Sunday Times poll.
Well, be that as it may, you asked me here to set out what my opinion
No, I
are.
just want just
And
pointing out
but we've
that
got to do
you
this
don't
very
represent
carefully.
your voters on
We've
this.
got to do this carefully and cautiously, and we've just heard from Caroline Flint that to go further would increase costs, and a cost of £96
to making
extra.
changes as well,
And
far bigger.
but you know, there goes Labour's so-called
the-
price
the
freeze.
problem
She's just
is-
announced they're
well,
going to put
let's-
prices up.
Okay,
problem is-
Caroline Flint, let's come
Okay.
on to that. Let's come on to that. Sorry to shout a little bit at you there, but you actually keyed me up perfectly for what we're moving on to as we move on to energy now. Now, Caroline Flint, energy prices are now falling. So it's just as well that you weren't in power when you came up with the idea of freezing our energy bills, isn't it?
Well, actually, if bills had been frozen at the time of Ed Miliband's speech, they would be lower than they are today. And you're right, wholesale costs have been falling pretty much for the last 15 months. And we've seen some small adjustments by the Big Six, only on gas, not on electricity, from between 1 to 5% cuts. What we have said all along is that we have to tackle what has happened in our energy sector, which is a lack of trust by the public in the way they're being dealt with by the Big Six. That's why we want to reform the energy market, have a price freeze for 20 months to stop bills rising, but also why we have said, in light of what's happening in the last 15 months, we want to give the power to the regulator to look at this issue around wholesale costs, and if they fall and reasonable reductions aren't passed on to customers, the regulator should have the power to do that. And there were two opportunities in Parliament this year, this year and a year or so before that, for both the Liberal Democrats and the Tories to support that power for the regulator, and they voted against
Matthew
it twice.
Hancock, it's quite clear that the Big Six, the big energy companies, have not passed on the full fall in wholesale prices. So why shouldn't the regulator have power to force them to do so?
Well, thank God we didn't vote to freeze energy prices when the Labour Party asked us to, because we would have frozen prices £100 higher than they are
If
today.
you frozen at the time of Ed Miliband's speech, they would be lower today.
No,
wouldn't
they were £100
No, not at
higher.
all.
And the
just
issue
not true.
is, how do you get the best possible deal for consumers? And the answer to that is to have more competitive markets. There are now 21 energy companies,
It's
not the
interesting
big
in answer
six
to the
that
question
Labour
Andrew asked
left.
you about
Yes,
this.
I
well,
noticed that too, Caroline, but what's the answer to my question?
Remember, just to remind Matt, that before the last election, David Cameron, the opposition leader, said there's something going on, I paraphrase it, but basically there's something going on where customers aren't receiving the benefit of wholesale cost falls. We will make sure we will put this right and make sure the regulator has the power to sort it out.
Firstly,
he's obviously changed his mind.
Firstly, I called in the Big Six and they responded by reducing their prices. Now they have
nothing like the fall in
but
wholesale
they have,
prices.
as well as the
only on
wholesale costs, they have fixed costs as well, like the cost of transmission and all those things, and some of the levies that you were talking about.
You'd already
and
given
we've
a rebate on that.
And we've brought down those costs. Labour want to put them
and
up.
as a result,
Their manifesto
as a
wants
result
to
of
put
your
them up.
reductions to the
And
energy company obligation, 400,000 fewer homes have got insulation.
And the consequence of all this is that bills are coming down.
Competition is the way to tackle this. People out there watching this, many of them can cut their energy bills today by switching to other the smaller players that we've encouraged. Sometimes £200 or £300 a year savings they can make. But under Labour, we had the Big Six. We now got 21 companies challenging the Big Six, which are offering a really good deal.
But the Big Six still dominate the market.
But much
And
less,
also,
less
Ed,
so. Their market share is
Ed, is
falling
it not the
rapidly.
case?
And what's really interesting, even
Is
though
it
we
not the
did that all
case
extra
that
competition,
the energy-
we've not been satisfied. We wanted to go further. That's why we supported the Independent Competition Authority's
Ed, is it
review.
not the case
That's a policy
that the
that Ed
energy
Miliband
companies do not
Hold on,
look
Caroline.
three
Okay.
times rejected. When Ed Miliband was doing my job, he helped create the Big Six. He didn't create competition,
Well-
and he rejected the case for
Well-
an independent
well, you
review
know, Ed.
3 times.
You
Ed
know, Ed,
Miliband
that-
should be apologising to the energy consumers, be they ordinary households out there or businesses, because Ed Miliband, far from being the energy consumers' price friend,
Well,
he's their enemy.
How
much of
He's
it-
sucked
okay.
up to the Big Six.
How much have electricity prices come down in the past year?
In the first year of which
In the
parliament?
past year.
Well, they come down about, well, it depends which you look at, because if you look at the fixed deals...
Just give it an average.
Well, if you look at the fixed deals, there are now about 10 sub-1,000 deals. That's a huge fall. Caroline quoted 1,300. I tell people out there, if they go on the Best Buy tables, if they look at the independent suppliers, they can get plenty of deals less than £1,000.
Okay, let me bring in Roger Helmer.
This is typical of the old party politicians. Prices have risen as a direct result of their policy decisions, and instead of fessing up to it, what they are doing is they're trying to blame the utility companies. And I would say to Ed, the whole justification for his very expensive renewables was that fossil fuel prices could only go up. That was the story, and renewables may not be competitive today, but they will be competitive in future years. What we have actually seen is coal prices, gas prices, oil prices down.
Okay, just before I come to...
They're not competitive.
Let me ask you this, Roger Helmer, just before I come to Andrew Sparrow here, Andrew Cooper, sorry. You complain about subsidies for renewables, and you say that that's put the cost up.
Yes.
But you fuel your own home with solar power, and you boast of making money out of it as well. You thought it was a very good return from the taxpayer.
Well, I believe that if people offer you free money, you should take it. I've got no complaints against those farmers who put wind farms on their land in order to get the subsidies. What I object to is the politicians who created those structures to start with.
So it's wrong, but you take
What's
advantage
shocking about
of it.
that, Ed? That's perfectly straightforward. If you're offered free money, then take it.
That's what
Let me come to Andrew Cooper.
No, I didn't say you shouldn't take the money. What I said was that you shouldn't have the policy. That's just not true, Ed. You just told a lie on air.
Andrew Cooper, you would take us to an entirely fossil-free and nuclear-free electricity generation, correct?
Correct.
We would be overwhelmingly dependent on renewables, particularly wind power.
Certainly.
What would happen?
Not just.
But
There's
let me ask
lots
you
of
this, and then you can
renewables.
answer.
Certainly.
What would happen when the wind doesn't blow?
Well, one of the great things we have is the national grid, which and the wind is usually blowing at some part of the country, but it's not the only form.
Well, times
not the,
it's
it's, not,
not
hang on a minute,
actually.
it's not the only form of renewable energy there is. There is solar, there is biomass, there is
We're a long way from
geothermal
either
energy.
of these.
There's a lot of.
Our overwhelming renewable alternative is wind power.
But that's one of the great things. We want to invest more in renewable technologies such as hydro, such as wind, wave. We're putting more money into research and development.
We've pretty much reached the limit of hydro in this country.
Not in terms of wind and wave.
There's a lot more
in wind and
Tidal
wave.
lagoon power is very exciting. That's why I...
And one of the
3 times the cost of real...
Roger.
So really, it's actually getting a good mix. I mean, one of the great things about renewable energy is there are lots of different forms of it, and that's a great thing we can do.
Let's just stick on wind for a moment. Matthew Hancock, you say, your party says that you're going to go for the most rational forms of energy and you want clean renewable energy. Yet you have turned your back on onshore wind, which is by far the cheapest form of readily available renewable energy. And people are baffled by this. I mean, energy experts have called it idiotic.
Hydro.
Yeah, well, they're wrong.
I said readily
There's a
available.
couple of things in that. The first is that the latest auctions showed that solar was in fact the cheapest form of renewables, and that's great, and I think the expansion of solar is superb. But there's a broader...
That's been superseded. That's changed because the solar firms have pulled out because they can't compete.
No, even those that haven't pulled out. But there's a broader point also, which is that we have to tackle carbon emissions, but we have to do it in a way that doesn't cost the Earth and also doesn't destroy our natural environment. Environmental policy, yes, is about carbon emissions, but it's also about the beauty of our green and pleasant land, and putting onshore turbines in the wrong places where they're not wanted is not acceptable to local communities, and we need to tackle that, whilst also supporting other renewable and low carbon. For instance, new nuclear is a low carbon source of energy. I can't understand why the Greens say they're in favour of new nuclear, but I've got a question for Caroline, which is that the SNP are against new nuclear, so would you have that as a red line, that you will back new nuclear even if Nicola Sturgeon tells you not to?
Actually, Matt, I'm not going to take any lectures from you on that, because
so when the last Labour government made the decision, particularly because of the development of our climate change policy, that we felt nuclear had to be part of the mix going forward. I think it seems to recall that David Cameron said it should be a last resort, and Liberal Democrats, including Ed Davey, were absolutely against it. So we're very clear. Nuclear power is part of our mix of energy for the future, and we've been
totally
Okay.
100%
Well,
behind.
we rule
But
out
can I
let's have a
ask
look.
Matt a
No, you
question?
can't, because
We rule
you've
out
had
dropping it.
more good enough.
Let's
Let,
rule
let,
out
let me
dropping
come
it.
to Ed David. The
We
point-
don't have to rule it
Excuse
out
me,
because it's
hold
actually
on.
our policy
There's
to
no
have
point
it.
having sidebar discussions. Nobody can hear you. Ed Davey, let me pick up the point that Caroline Flynn just made there. In 2010, your manifesto flatly rejected nuclear power. Now you're building the most expensive nuclear power station ever, and you want to build more. I mean, isn't it true that you're just as trustworthy on energy as you were on tuition fees?
Listen, we did change our position and publicly did that, but I don't regret that simply because.
So you were wrong.
Simply because of the risk of climate change coming into power, seeing how much green electricity we need to replace fossil fuel plants, coal plants, gas plants, to replace the nuclear power plants that are aging. 8 out of 9 nuclear power plants are closing by the middle of the next
Sure, but
decade.
you must have
So we
known
have
all
to-
that in
so we have to-
2006. In
so we have to-
2006, you said no to nuclear power, even though you knew that the fossil fuel plants would have to close. You said no to nuclear power.
That's true. I've completely admitted that. But we also looked at the numbers when we came into government. And the numbers of green electricity you need actually really surprised me, because not only do you have to do that on the electricity side, but you're going to need green electricity for the heat, for the transport. So I think people out there don't understand how much, and I don't think I did, how much green electricity we're going to need in the future.
But you-
and you
Well,
can,
nuclear is
and
not-
wind can do that,
There is-
solar can do that,
Okay,
tidal
let
can
me
do that,
bring in Andrew.
but,
But what-
nuclear has a role to play in a balanced
Right.
mixed
What's
approach.
the answer to? What's your view on that? Because you're against.
Well-
surely, if you want to decarbonize the economy, nuclear power, along with renewables, has a major role to play.
But there's a
Many
there's a
Greens
choice.
think that Greens with a small G.
Well, yeah, but there's a choice here. It's going to cost consumers £24 billion for the Hinkley C plant. And as we've heard, those costs could rise enormously. And most of that work is actually going to go to French and Chinese companies. And that money would be much better spent in terms of energy efficiency, in terms of renewables. And of course, we've not.
Well, it's not either.
Of course.
We have
All right.
Of course, one of the.
Well, you've all
one of the-
mentioned
one of the
energy
key-
efficiency. Let me bring in the expert. on
Okay,
that, Roger.
Matthew Hancock, another question for you, if I may. You have insulated 5 million homes this Parliament. Experts say energy efficiency is by far the best solution to energy problems. It means fewer emissions, warmer homes, lower bills, and fewer power stations you need to build. Next time round, you're planning to build to insulate 1 million homes. And along these terms, it could take 300 years before the UK's homes are properly insulated. And that's baffling a lot
Why are
of
you
people.
not doing more?
Well, let me split out those two figures, because an awful lot of energy efficiency measures are paid for and happen completely independently of government, especially because you can bring down your energy bills by putting in energy efficiency measures. You can bring down bills and pay for it up front yourself, and huge numbers, millions of people do that, and that's very sensible. The 1 million in the manifesto is the commitment to support 1 million people who can't afford to do that themselves, and help that to happen so that everybody can benefit from these
we showed
efficiency
in the
measures.
coalition that you could do be far more ambitious on energy efficiency. As it was, Roger said, we managed to do 5 million homes, 1 million homes ahead of our target in the last 2 years, really achieving. And Liberal Democrats are very ambitious on energy efficiency.
No,
we want a
that's
Green Buildings
nonsense.
Act to
Total
massively
nonsense.
increase our targets.
Absolute
because
nonsense.
you're right, it is the best way. And I cannot understand why the Tories are turning their back on this, because it's the cheapest form of energy efficiency.
This is a
Andrew
classic.
Cooper.
This is a classic case of talking the talk but not walking the walk.
It's in our
There have
manifesto.
been- it might be in your manifesto.
And it's our record, we've actually done it.
It
Lots
might
of
be in
things
your.
are in
It might be in your.
manifesto.
It might
It's
be
our
in.
record, we've actually done it.
All right.
It might be in your manifesto, but it's certainly not in your record. You've had huge cuts to the energy company obligation.
me-
You've
Our
had
target.
huge.
Our
You've had
target was 1
huge
million.
cuts to insulation program. There are hundreds of thousands of homes of fuel poor people who are not going to be insulated because your government cut the energy company obligation. You were the ones who did that. Don't try and wriggle out of it.
Let me answer
Don't
that
try and wriggle out of
directly,
it.
because that's a very
It's true.
serious accusation. Let
Okay,
me
well,
say,
answer it.
we had a debate in government about the future of the energy company obligation. The Tories wanted to cut it to try to take £50 off bills, and we actually worked very well to do that. But I put a line in the sand. I said that part of the energy company obligation that helped the fuel poor would not be cut, and it was not cut.
That is
Yeah,
we succeeded.
Okay, I want people
that
to
is
make up
just
their minds. I want
super-
just to
absolutely
move on.
No.
This is
Because some of
relevant
the
to
money in
cost.
the other parts of the energy
Hold
company
on.
obligation was
This is relevant to cost.
All right,
because
this
the
is
question
relevant to
Caroline
cost, and I
has
want to
asked is
ask
how will
Caroline
she
just quick questions for a couple of you. It was the last Labour government, Caroline Flynn, that brought in the green levies. They're now about £115 added on to the average household bill.
That's insulation as well as
There's
renewable
no
support.
there's no mention of green levies in the Labour manifesto this year. Why not? And how much will they go up by?
Well, we'll continue to support the development of renewables, but you'll forgive me if when we look in government we see how much we want to do on that. Likewise,
But will the levies go up?
Likewise, what we have said is on energy efficiency is we think there's a better way to actually spend the money that's already
Will
there.
the levies go up?
Look, the issue around the levies are determined by what we're putting into the sector. What we want to do is make... Well, let's just remember something. On the green levies, it's £60 of the average bill of £1,300. Now, the truth is, why we have gone so hard on the issues around the energy companies, the big six, and how they operate, is to make sure that they tackle the side of the bill that they're responsible for, that they're not passing on to customers. So it is important to get this balance right. But
Matthew Hancock. Tories want to go all out for shale. These are your party's words. And you mentioned Britain's green and pleasant land. So would you welcome energy firms seeking permission for fracking in one of your own constituency beauty spots like East Town Park or Newton Park?
Well, as it happens, there isn't any shale gas in that particular part of the country, but I've been very clear...
Welcome it in your own constituency if it was a beauty spot.
I'd be open to having shale gas in any part of the country, so long as it is explored for in a way that is careful and cautious and with a deep respect for the natural environment. In fact, hold on. In fact, the first thing that I did as energy minister was bring in a rule to say that you couldn't have shale gas exploration within national parks. So I think this is important. I think it's important that we do this, but we've got to do it carefully and cautiously.
The science says that the shale gas should remain in the ground. The 4/5 of known hydrocarbon, the 4/5 of hydrocarbon reserves.
There's nothing of the sort.
The 4/5 of hydrocarbon reserves should be kept there.
I'd rather
have
gas from the UK than from Russia or from Qatar.
The problem is that we've actually wasted some valuable time in the last 4 years because we do use a lot of gas. I think it's 80% of our heating, and therefore we're going to rely on gas for some time to come. Now, our position has been is that we haven't set our face against it. But where this whole debate has gone wrong is, unfortunately, the government have been incredibly gun-ho about what can be achieved in a short space of time and how to bring prices down. Instead of attending to what the people want.
Well, they haven't got any fracking gas out of the ground yet.
Exactly. And instead of actually...
That's not gun-ho.
If I can finish, if I can... Andrew, tax breaks, talking up the jobs, talking out how it's going to bring prices down. But also Tories polarising shale gas against...
Let's move on to the countryside. Let's move on to the countryside. Ed Davey, on the issue of floods, I mean, Lib Dems, you administer in DEFRA for much of this parliament. Do you take some responsibility for the havoc the floods wreaked last year?
This government's actually invested a huge amount in flood defences, and I don't think you can actually blame any government, whether it's a Labour government, a coalition government, a Liberal Democrat government, a Conservative government, for the effects of climate change. What we need to do is tackle climate change by going green, and we also need to adapt our lifestyles in this country and help some of the poorest countries in the world, because climate change is already happening. It caused the flooding, in my view, that you talked to. Obviously, the science will now analyse that in great detail, but the scientists do suggest that extreme weather events are much more common and much more damaging because of climate change, and therefore that's why we need to invest seriously in adapting our lives and our countries and our economy to climate change.
Why did you cut the funding?
Why did you cut the funding for flooding? If that's the case.
We in the last, Matt, you may correct me if I'm wrong, but in the last 5 years, I think we invested far more than last government.
Ed, just to break that down.
Can I give you the figures, please, so you can then debate among yourselves? The National Audit Office, spending on maintenance had fallen by 6% in real terms in the 5 years of the coalition. Overall funding had fallen by 10% in real terms.
This is a classic case of talking the talk and not walking the walk.
Had to add the private sector funding.
Roger,
there was a lot of evidence at the time suggesting that in fact it was green policies that caused the flooding, because what they wanted to do in the interests of the environment was to allow the floodplain there to revert to a natural state. As a result, there was far less dredging, and people who worked in the area, you can laugh all you want, but people who worked in the area and have known it for decades said it was the failure to dredge which caused that flood.
Well, that's a good point, isn't it, Caroline Flynn? I mean, because the last Labour government almost had kind of ideological opposition to dredging. Baroness Young, Labour peer, head of the Environment Agency, said, "I'd like to see limpet mines put on every pumping station. Have you dropped that ideological opposition to dredging?
I don't think that's in our manifesto, that particular policy. But what we did do...
So you're in favour of dredging now?
Look, I think dredging has a purpose, but it's not necessarily suitable for every situation to avoid flooding.
But it was suitable for that situation.
And what I would say to Roger, and my own area in Doncaster did suffer by floods under the last Labour government. And what we did was, well, it wasn't the Labour government who did that, but what we did was make sure, absolutely sure. Well, I have to say, there was a UKIP representative who said the floods were due to the gay marriage policy, but that's another story for another day. But look, the thing is that under the Labour government, Hilary Benn, we increased the amount of resources to deal with adaptations and tackling floods. That did go down, as Andrew said quite rightly. And the truth is, what we need now is a proper long-term plan to look at how we build resilience in. And that includes asking critical infrastructure, airports, hospitals, schools, and all of that to make sure that they report on how they're dealing with it. And it's why we've also said the Infrastructure Commission can play an important role in prevention.
Roger's got a question for you, so we'll hear from you.
Okay, well, let's take it a bit more broadly to the countryside and how it looks and how it is. As you know, if we let our hill farms go back to their natural state, most of them would be woodland, some of them would be moorland. The thing that's shaping the look of the British countryside is agricultural subsidies, and particularly in hill areas to hill farmers. I'm just wondering, do you want Britain to go back to a wilderness state, or do you want to continue paying farmers to farm in areas it's uneconomic? I'm not quite sure what your policy is on that.
Are you talking about the Green Party?
Yes.
Yeah.
We want a mixture of things. Obviously, agriculture is important. We need wild areas. But yeah, subsidies can be used to bring very positive policies forward on
Indeed,
that.
that's what's said at the moment. But would you remove subsidies from hill farmers, given that they're only marginal anyway, and let the land go back to the natural state? It's an idea of rewilding promoted. It's quite fashionable in green circles.
Yeah, I've heard George Monbiot said that. I think in some instances that there may be some benefits from that. But I think it's
CAP.
I think it's one of those things where we would look to finding different solutions in different areas as they're appropriate.
Well, Roger Helmer, do you think that the EU should continue subsidising our farmers up to, Roger telling me, 300,000 euros? Indeed, Roger, you visited one farmer recently who got €1 million.
He's getting €1 million a year. I asked him, do you need the money? He said no.
No, I don't believe the EU should continue subsidising our farmers. I believe that we should leave the European Union, and then we would have a farm subsidy policy designed in Britain for British farmers, not a policy designed in Brussels for French farmers. And I do want to make that point very strongly for any farmers who may be watching, although they'll probably be working.
So they still get subsidies, that's from London, not Brussels?
Yes, and designed for the British agricultural environment. If you go and talk to farmers, as I often do, because I live in a fairly rural area, they like getting the cheque, but they are very unhappy about some of the terms which they have to fulfil in order to get the cheque. We would work with the farming industry to deliver those subsidies that were necessary in a much more user-friendly way.
Is Labour in favour of these subsidies for farmers?
I think in some cases it is important that we support farming, but I think also we should...
Up to 300,000 euros per farmer?
I think
£1 million to Roger's
You could cut
farm?
it off. You've cut social benefits. You could cut off at 300,000.
I think in different...
We're allowed to.
There's different types of farming, aren't there? In different
We're
parts
allowed
of the
to under
country.
European
We're allowed to under European law to cut off subsidy at 300,000.
We've always said that we should look at how we reform the CAP, but also we've also said that there's not one type of farming in one part of the country that's the same for everywhere else. So I do think you have to look across the sector. What I would say, though, is that I think some of the monies could go to engage with farmers to work with us on things like adaptation, for example, on things like biodiversity. And that is something the last Labour government did champion, and lots of farmers, I have to say, including my own area of Doncaster, took the opportunity to do that. But I think, again, it's about looking at how we both support the industry, but also allow it to grow in different ways. I've got a farmer near me who's looking to develop solar on his farm.
Small farm businesses are also one of the ones that we really ought to be pushing, rather than big, large agricultural...
Well, I don't think the small farms are the ones giving the 300.
No, they're the ones that we need to support.
Hancock, we've got a hunting ban in place. It's a hunting ban that a majority of people support, according to the polls. The Parliament passed it. But you want to reopen this issue again. Why?
Well, we think that we should have a free vote on hunting in the next Parliament. It's about supporting not only our rural environment, which, as Roger says, it's a man-made and man-managed environment.
But hunting's going on in some shape or form anyway at the moment. Why reopen this issue?
But it's also about supporting our rural way of life. And this is something that happens.
But I see big pictures of the hunt taking place all the time.
Drag
at the
hunts
moment.
are very popular, and in fact, what we were told at the time of the hunting ban that dogs would be killed, that it wouldn't happen, has not materialised. There are now drag hunting going on. I refuse to accept that fox hunting, in of itself, is the most precious thing in terms of preserving rural communities. Lots of people in rural communities.
Rural broadband is the most important thing you can do for the rural economy. Then things like, when I was Post Office Minister, we stopped Labour's previous post office closure programme, and we've kept post offices alive in many of our villages.
It's a long way to go on rural broadband, isn't there?
Well, there is still a way to go, but we've really quickened it under this government, and I actually pay tribute to Saji,
Andrew Cooper,
DCMS, who's really gone forward.
So
if you're serious about improving economic growth in our rural areas, which Liberal Democrats
I understand that.
I don't think getting rid of the hunting ban is going to make any difference.
I represent a rural constituency as a parish councillor, and we've been trying to get rural broadband there for quite a while, but it's government that's actually causing difficulty. It's government that's actually making it difficult for rural communities to get rural broadband. There are lots of barriers that are actually put in the way, and government should help us.
So the other big issue we haven't mentioned is building on the green belt. And the Conservative Party in their last manifesto said they would give more power to local people to make those decisions. In fact, they've done exactly the opposite. And they've created a situation where there is a quasi-obligation on local authorities to build on green belts.
Well, the national...
and we're not being serious.
But hold on, you want a massive house building programme, but at the same time you want all the planning laws, the planning decisions to be taken at a local level. You never get your house building programme.
Well, if you go to the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, you will find they say that UKIP is the only party with a viable and workable programme to solve Britain's long-term housing crisis.
One of the real problems.
They've said it in their recent analysis of our manifesto.
Quickly, and then Roger.
One of the real problems we have is we have a lot of developers who are land banking. There's lots of planning permission that's out there.
How much?
We've got, well, in our particular council, we've got thousands of.
No, how much nationally is all this? Because I hear this all the time, but no one can tell me how much. How much land ready for building is being banked rather than used?
Yeah, I can tell you. I can give you examples from our council, but they can be replicated across the country.
Okay, Roger.
Here's a question for Caroline Flint. If you look at the Conservatives' manifesto, they want to develop the policies they've got of valuing our natural capital, our soil, our water, our air, actually putting a cash value on it and setting a timetable to restore the countryside to proper health. If you look at Labour's main manifesto, and I haven't seen your more detailed one you published today, you told me earlier on, if you look at the main manifesto, there's almost nothing about the countryside in it at all.
But what our policy is to have a 25-year plan with 5-year milestones to look at how we are helping recovery in our natural environment. And one of the issues we want to address, which I think actually builds on our record in the past. We brought in Right to Roam, both in the countryside and on the coastal paths, but we want to also look at how better we can bring, for example, woodlands closer to where people are. So we have a 25-year plan with 5-year milestones.
We need stronger legislative protection. I think we can learn from the Climate Change Act, which has been successful. I think we need a new Nature Act to have really strong statutory targets on clean air, clean water and biodiversity.
Well, it's in my nature to finish this debate with some quick-fire questions, and I want very quick answers. Do you support genetically modified foods? Roger.
Broadly speaking, subject to proper controls, yes.
Yes.
No.
Yes.
I think we need to look at the science and be sure that it's...
haven't you done that already?
We've got more science, I think, to do to make sure about the consequences for the environment, but also for consumers.
Would you support more onshore wind turbines?
Yes.
We don't think there should be any subsidies in the future.
Yes.
Yes.
We wouldn't support any wind farms.
Okay, for country people, petrol is a big cost. They have to do more driving because of the distance. Would you raise, or do you guarantee not to raise, fuel duties?
We would do so, yes.
You would guarantee not to raise?
Not to raise fuel duties.
I think we do in line with inflation like most governments do.
You would, just to clarify, you would let them rise in line?
Well, that's an option. I mean, what we've done in the coalition, we've actually frozen them in normal terms for most of the parliament, partly because of the difficult economic situation, the cost of living. But most governments have at least let them go above the cost of living.
We would support low emission vehicles which would provide alternatives to rural.
But would you put out? Yeah, but that'll take a while. Would you put up fuel duties?
It can be done now, but yes.
We've done better than that. We brought them down by fuel duty down by one
So the
penny.
next Conservative government won't increase them.
We've brought them down in
I
this
didn't ask
parliament.
about what you've
about
done.
the
I'm
next
asking
one?
what will you do?
Telling
Well, we certainly don't have any plans to, but
No
and we
plans
don't
to.
need to.
Like
the-
no plans to raise VAT.
But
No
no, but
answer.
we brought them down. Not only have we
that.
brought them
Okay.
down, but also the'd be a tenner higher per tank
Yeah,
if we
right.
followed Labour's
Caroline
plans.
Flynn, but we only got 10 seconds in this part. Would the next Labour government raise fuel duties?
We'd look at that in line with inflation, as Ed said, but we can't make promises that we cannot make sure they're affordable. But low emission cars are also an answer to this as well.
In line with inflation.
Time now for our five parties to make their final pitches to you on why their party has the best policies on the environment. They only have 30 seconds, and it's in reverse order. It's a bit like Miss World, really. Let's begin with Roger Helmer of UKIP.
Well, the situation that we face today is that energy prices are far higher than they need to be. That is not an accident of fate. That is the result of deliberate policies pursued by the parties that you see here on the right of me. We in UKIP say we want to rely on proven, low-cost energy technologies that can deliver secure and affordable energy for households, for pensioners, but also for industry. And I stress the point that we are driving industries offshore to jurisdictions where they are producing higher emissions per unit of production than they are here.
Ed Davey.
Liberal Democrats have a very proud record on the environment in government. Not only have we nearly trebled renewable electricity in Britain, but internationally we've led the debate for tougher environmental and climate change targets in Europe and at the UN. Moreover, we've planted 1 million trees, we've taxed plastic bags and so on. And on our manifesto, on the front page of our manifesto, we've put a commitment for 5 new green laws to help on nature, to help on increasing our ambition on climate change and make sure people's homes are much greener. And in a balanced parliament that we're looking, it's the Liberal Democrats that can guarantee strong environmental policies.
All right. Andrew Cooper.
Action on climate change has been feeble. While other countries produce over 50% of their energy from renewable sources, we produce little over 5%. Malta and Luxembourg have a worse record. We need to invest in insulating over 9 million new homes and taking 2 million people out of fuel poverty. The consequences of failing to address the problem are already being felt. We need Greens in the Parliament to push for real commitment to address climate change. Vote for what you believe in, vote Green.
Thank you for that. Matt Hancock.
I think what you've heard today is a debate with a great deal of chaos between the other parties and one party that proposes a clear, long-term plan. Yes, to tackle carbon emissions and live within our international obligations, but to do so in a way that brings the minimum possible cost. And I'm an optimist that with new technology and with international agreement, we can tackle this problem in a way that ultimately brings costs down and at the same time invest in our energy infrastructure so that we don't get to the stage that we don't have that infrastructure for the future. And what you've heard today...
Time gone. Sorry. Time gone.
This election is a choice between 5 more years of the Tories' failing plan where energy companies carry on ripping people off, fewer homes get help with insulation, and Britain falls behind in the green economy and loses influence overseas. Or Labour's better plan with fair energy bills, help to make homes warmer and cheaper to heat, extending public access to nature and safeguarding our environment for future generations. Leadership from a Labour government on climate change at home, important to secure influence abroad.
Thank you very much, and thanks to you all. That's it for today's debate. My thanks to our guests, a special thanks to Roger Harrigan. Now, tomorrow we turn to foreign affairs. I'll be joined by the Foreign Secretary Philip Hammond, Shadow Foreign Secretary Douglas Alexander, and representatives from the Lib Dems, UKIP and the Greens, and by the BBC's diplomatic editor Bridget Kendall to help keep them honest. Plus, don't forget, the Daily Politics Election Special is back tomorrow, as always, every weekday at noon. But from all of us here, from our first debate, bye-bye.